A new study out of Japan suggests that creatine monohydrate supplementation may be a useful strategy to help address symptoms of long COVID. Before we get too excited, I will say that this is a very small study, and the results published in this study are just okay. There's nothing eyebrow raising from this particular study, but I'm going to make a case for you that creatine supplementation probably is worthwhile if you're dealing with something like long COVID. First, a little bit of background. In previous iterations of post-viral fatigue stemming from things like Epstein-Barr virus or the flu, and people that develop chronic fatigue syndrome, it's been shown that these patients have benefited from supplementation with creatine monohydrate. So in 2021, there was a study that actually looked at the creatine levels in the tissues of patients with long COVID, and it was found that in the muscle tissue and in brain tissue of patients with long COVID, that there are decreased levels of creatine inside of their cells compared to normal established values. Most people associate creatine with bodybuilding or muscle building, but creatine is really an important piece of our cellular energy systems. We have three main energy pathways. One is the aerobic pathway, which is what we associate with long-term endurance training. The anaerobic pathway is when we do high-intensity interval training, and direct phosphorylation is just where creatine is used to actually produce rapid bursts of energy that we use for sprinting or lifting big weights. When we are healthy, we have the ability to switch between these three systems at any given time, depending on what our body's energy needs are. But if we were to develop something called mitochondrial dysfunction, then our ability to use some of these systems may become compromised, or using some of these systems, specifically that anaerobic pathway, may become broken, and that actually produces inflammation that will create more harm to our bodies. It's been thought that some of these post-viral fatigue syndromes are related to mitochondrial dysfunction, and that we may be able to buffer the effects of this mitochondrial dysfunction by giving our cells more access to the creatine phosphorylation system. So this particular study took 15 people and randomized them into a creatine solution, a creatine plus glucose solution, and a control condition, which was basically just sugar water. To no one's surprise, the creatine and glucose group both increased the levels of brain and muscle creatine compared to the placebo. In terms of symptoms, the creatine and glucose group both showed improvement in long COVID symptoms compared to the placebo group, with the creatine and glucose group actually performing just a little bit better in the number of total symptoms affected. However, neither creatine group really outperformed placebo in terms of statistical significance, so it didn't seem like there was much of an effect during an 8-week study. Now, this might have been because the sample size wasn't big enough, or it just wasn't a long enough duration in terms of being on the creatine to make a difference. But this wasn't the only study done. Back in 2023, there was a study that showed that 6 months of creatine supplementation did seem to have an improvement in terms of tissue creatine levels and helping with COVID-19 fatigue syndrome. So even though the results of this study are just okay, here's why I'm still optimistic about the use of creatine supplementation for this condition. First and foremost is the idea that creatine is one of the most well-studied supplements in existence, second to only maybe caffeine, and its safety track record is tremendous even among both sick and healthy populations. Second is that we know that creatine does seem to have some positive impact on the brain, and this is specifically prevalent when the brain is under some sort of duress. So there's been studies that have been shown that creatine helps under states of hypoxia, and there's also been some small studies that show some benefit in patients with traumatic brain injury. So don't go into this thinking that this is a cure. It's far from it. There is no cure for long COVID, and we may be a long way from even having viable treatments for long COVID. But in the absence of a cure, all we could do is focus on interventions that can meaningfully improve our quality of life when you have this type of an illness. And because creatine has a good track record of being studied over a long period of time, it's been shown to be safe, and it has some promise for affecting the brain and improving brain function. I think this is something with a low risk and a potentially moderate to high reward.